Hey guys, Petrik here. Today's video will be my monthly wrap-up. I will be covering all the books that I managed to finish in September, and I will be doing a mini review for each of them. Similar to my TBR video, I will be dividing this into my physical and my ebooks read. So yeah, let's get started. The first two physical books I'm going to talk about is the first two books in the Traitor Sun cycle, which is The Red Knight and The Fell Sword. I'm going to combine my reviews for these two because, well, the things that I like and dislike are pretty much the same in these two books. Okay guys, I think it's time to admit that these two books aren't for me. If you're on Goodreads, you probably have read my reviews on them, but let's just say that I won't be continuing with the series. It is such a shame, I know, because I've already bought the entire series, but it just isn't working for me. The first issue that I have with the series is, as I mentioned in my TBR video, from my early impression, the number of POV. Again, it's not that I have problem with the number of POV itself, but I have issues in that almost all of them are so redundant. They doesn't have to be there. They become an obstruction in the way of the narrative. This was especially true in the first book, and I'm not saying that the second book has less POV. It actually has even more. But the biggest issue I had with the number of POV is that not only they're redundant, but I couldn't care about them at all. I couldn't care about them, seriously. Let's look at it this way. By the second book, I'm pretty sure there are at least 100 characters' names already mentioned. That's a lot for two books. And you know how many characters that I actually care? 3 or 4. That's it. At least in the second half of The Red Knight, there's a lot of interesting going on because the siege of Lysen Karak was superbly written. I love the battles, but here's the thing about great battles. We have to care about the characters. And again, as I mentioned, I didn't care about the characters. I thought I will grow to care about them in the second book, but that didn't happen. In fact, in the second book, it gets worse for me because the amount of time you spend with a great character is so short. And the time you have to spend reading through a lot of other POVs just to get to that character again can be incredibly long. I'm speaking about 50 or 150 pages before you get back to that POV again. That's so awful. So pretty much for me, it's like slogging through a lot of pages just to get to the good parts. And the good parts is always so short. And to make things even worse, the world building absolutely didn't click for me at all. The definition of high fantasy itself means that the series takes place in a secondary world, or maybe at most secondary or alternative. But I don't know about the Traitor Sun cycle. I mean, it supposedly takes place in the secondary world, but everything feels like medieval England. And I'm not speaking about it like A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. We know that despite it being inspired by Wars of the Roses, the world in A Song of Ice and Fire felt completely like a high fantasy, with its own cultures, with its own history, with their own gods, their own world building, and their intricate and complex family dispute. But that's not the case here. The world itself doesn't feel like high fantasy, and the characters, all of them worship Jesus Christ. So every time the characters goes, oh, by sweet Jesus, oh, Judas Iscariot, oh, Blessed Virgin Mary. What is this series? Is this historical fiction? It's not. Is it historical fantasy? It's not. You know what? I don't even know what to call this series. I seriously don't. It's unfortunate, but I won't be continuing with the Traitor Sun cycle, even though I already own the books. Another physical book that I managed to finish this month was Persepolis Rising by James A. Corey. This is the 7th book in the Expand series. This is a good book. I mostly enjoyed what I've read it. I gave this one 3.5 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed Persepolis Rising, but I have to admit that I think the book series is slightly overrated, in my opinion. There is this storytelling choice that the authors decided to use throughout this series that I simply couldn't click with. So in this series, within each book, Corey will introduce a new main characters to follow. I, for some reason, couldn't find myself invested in them. None of them felt well realized as the crew of Rocinante. And I'm serious, I truly enjoyed reading about the crew of Rocinante. Holden, Naomi, Alex and Amos, plus Abasarala and Bobby are truly fantastic characters. I love reading about them. But that's also where the issue of this series lies for me. They're the only characters that I care about. And in Persepolis Rising, that problem persists. There is a huge time jump between book 6 and book 7. I'm speaking about 30 years here. But for some reason, it doesn't feel that way. The characters still behave exactly the same after 30 years. And the relationship between the characters doesn't change that much. I just don't find it too believable after 30 years. The thing is, Daniel Abraham, one of the author in James S.A. Corey duo, he writes this fantasy series called The Long Price Quartet. In The Long Price Quartet, each book, it features a 15 years time jump. And in that 15 years, we always get to see what has changed. We get to see what stayed the same. And I think it's incredible how Abraham managed to do that. But in here, after 30 years, I didn't get that feeling. So yeah, I mostly enjoyed this one. As I mentioned, I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. I still think it's a good book, and I will definitely continue to the 8th book. The fourth and final physical book that I managed to complete in September is The Girl and the Stars by Mark Lawrence. It takes place in the same world as Book of the Ancestor trilogy by Mark Lawrence also. I'm very grateful that Mark sent me this book to review, but again, I have to admit that this one didn't really work for me as well. And you probably noticed from my reviews now that I'm a hugely character-driven reader. I need to care about the characters, otherwise, well, as I mentioned for the previous 3 books I just said, it doesn't work. Probably the biggest issue I had with this book is that it felt so YA. I mean, Mark Lawrence in almost all of his series, except the Red Queen's War trilogy, featured a young protagonist, York, Nona Grey, and then Yas. But in the case of York, especially York and Nona, none of them felt like we're reading YA fantasy. You know how it is. The main character doesn't realize she's special, and then all the dudes that she met fell in love with her immediately, even though they've spent only a brief amount of time together. And well, this isn't like the Book of the Ancestor where I immediately found myself invested with Nona and her relationship with the side characters. It didn't happen here. Hopefully the second book, when it comes out, The Girl and the Mountain, will be able to fix that. Fingers crossed. That's all the physical books that I managed to finish this month. For the ebooks read, I managed to finish 3 books. It's Ghost Story, the 13th book in the Dresden Files, and then Cold Days, the 14th book in the Dresden Files. I don't know how Jim Butcher did it, guys. I mean, it's crazy. It's 14 books already, and the series has been incredibly consistent in their quality. Every book since the 4th book up to the 14th book so far, none of them received anything below 4 stars for me. Only the first 3 books can be considered weak. And I'm genuinely surprised by Ghost Story because so many fans of the series called Ghost Story the weakest book in the series. I didn't think of it that way. It is a different kind of book, especially after the brutal cliffhanger of Changes. So it's Ghost Story is kinda like a soft reset. Ghost Story kinda signified the beginning of the second half of the Dresden Files, especially because, if I'm not mistaken, Jim Butcher has mentioned that this series will be in total 25 books long. So yeah, that sounds about right, that the 13th book kinda reset everything. And Cold Days, amazing. I think it's the biggest book in the series so far, and I didn't felt bored by it at all. Everything was so engaging. Even the action sequences, I usually have problem with the longevity of the actions in the Dresden Files. For many books in the series, I just don't think that the actions have to be that long. But in Cold Days, I was thoroughly hooked. Both Ghost Story and Cold Days were pretty good. I gave Ghost Story 4 stars, and I gave Cold Days 4.5 stars. And the final book that I managed to finish within this month is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is the first book in Between Earth and Sky trilogy, and I'm going to consider Black Sun my favorite book of the month. And I think you will actually see this in my favorite book of the year list. Black Sun is amazing. The world building is fascinating, and the characters were incredibly easy to care for. And it is such a great feeling that when I'm reading a book, I could see every scene played out in my mind like a movie. I love that kind of feeling, and I totally get that while I'm reading Black Sun. So yeah, Black Sun is definitely my favorite book that I read in September. Well, that's all the books that I managed to finish within September. In my September TBR video, I did mention that I want to read 7 books, right? And well, I did it. I pretty much read everything that I planned to read except Mort, because The Girl and the Stars came and I decided to read that one instead. I'm postponing reading Discworld for now. I don't know when I'll get to them because my TBR pile is insane. So yeah, that's all the books that I completed this month. And tell me what's your favorite book of the month and how many books did you finish. As always, thank you so much for watching and thank you for the support. Bye!